I accept the result was to get out of Europe. Yep, that's clear.
So what do we do now?
So what I also think is that we've got to be very careful now to take our time and really work out what the consequences are of exit and what our new relationship with Europe is going to be. And here's where I think it's important we do not rush this process. There is absolutely no need to rush it. I think in the next 2 or 3 months, the present Prime Minister's got an important role to play in shaping how that negotiating framework will proceed. And I think it's important for the country to see what are the actual consequences, what's the reality of leaving, and what possible options are there for new relationships.
The leaders of Europe, including the leader of the Commission, President Juncker, and several others, President of the European Parliament, have said there's no point waiting. Just apply for Article 15 now under the Lisbon Treaty. It starts the process. Let's get on with it. What do you say to them?
What I say to them is I understand that, and I understand their frustration and dismay at the result in Britain, but it's not in the interest of Europe or in Britain to rush this. I mean, we're dealing with vast consequences for our economy, for our politics, for our security, and we've got to take it very carefully. Now, my view, I've worked very closely with Angela Merkel. I know her very well. She is a very sensible person. I mean, she has those good German qualities of practical common sense and realism, and she will want to do this, I think, in a way that gets the best for Europe and indeed for Britain, because people want to retain that relationship with Britain. And I don't know how much room for manoeuvre these people that have led the Leave campaign really feel they have. And I mean particularly Boris Johnson, Michael Gove. But I think they also have a big responsibility to try and help our country get itself through what is going to be, an agonizing and highly complicated process of defining a new relationship with Europe. See, I mean, the odd thing about this whole referendum, when you think about it, is it's like saying to someone, right, you're going to swap your house, right? You know where you live, but you're going to swap it for another house. And right now, we can give you 2 people. You can't see that other house, but we can give you 2 people who'll tell you what they think. And one says, this house is fantastic, you're going to love it, it's going to be great for you. And the other says, actually, this house is structurally unsound, you're going to hate it. Right. So we have taken the decision to swap homes, if you like, without having seen what the other thing looks like. Over this next period of time, we're going to see what it looks like. We're going to see what the reality is. And we're then going to get right into the detail, because the detail matters. I mean, if you take, for example, financial services, if we don't have the EU passport, as it's called, for our financial services, what does that mean for the City of London? You could have thousands of jobs going. So how do you preserve it? These detailed questions around agriculture, fisheries, what does the car industry do? We've got hundreds of thousands of jobs dependent on the car industry. So I think the detail is going to really matter, and we need to take our time over this so that the country also carries on being engaged in a debate about what this really means.
But what would you advise Boris Johnson and Michael Gove to go for in terms of the overall relationship? The details will take a long while, I understand that. But broadly, what kind of relationship would you advise them to have going forward?
Well, I think one that self-evidently preserves as much as we possibly can of our access to the market in Europe, because that's essential for us. I mean, half of our trade is with Europe. But secondly, which allows us at least some influence on decisions that Europe might make that are going to have a direct bearing on Britain. Because one of the things that has been so curious about this whole process is that, we are an independent country. We're an independent country now. I mean, when I say to people, I think of the 10 years I had as Prime Minister, I can't think of a single big decision that Europe said to me I had to make or I couldn't make, other than those that were to do with Europe specifically. But now we're going to be in this new relationship with Europe. We've got to work out, well, what really is in our interests. And this is why I think, we've got to understand something as well. I think it's very important about where the country is today. It is deeply divided. I mean, yes, the Leave camp won, but 48% voted Remain. I think there is a lot of dismay and indeed anger amongst that 48%. I think a lot of young people particularly feel that their future has been changed in a way that they profoundly disagree with. And so if there is a desire in the Leave camp to try and bring the country back together, if there is a maturity there in the politics of Leave, then I think we also have to show a maturity from the politics of Remain and work out how we do this best for the country. But that argues for a negotiating process which is very deliberative and which allows the country at every stage to see this is the reality, right? You've heard all the claims and counterclaims. It's no longer about claims and counterclaims. This is the reality of what we can have and what we can't.
Do you rule out another referendum?
As I'm looking at it here, I can't see how we can do that. But, you know, the point is, why rule anything out right now? You might as well, as I say, you're going to have a reality to test yourself against. So, for example, in the last few days, obviously, there's been this vast crash in the financial markets. I think something like $3 trillion has been wiped out of financial markets globally. The pound's obviously fallen dramatically. But maybe that steadies itself in the days to come. Well, the British people need to see that reality. The Europeans need to see that reality. Maybe as we get into it, there are companies that say, look, you know, we're perfectly happy, we can live with this new arrangement. Some may say, well, we can't. So we need to see the consequences.
Well, if we get the new house, as you said, if we finally see the structure, we see what's in the new house, we see the house that we're now going to move into outside the EU, should that go for a referendum?
Well, as I say, I can't see how you go through all the mechanics of another referendum now. I just can't see it. But on the other hand, I also think there will be a lot of people in the country who will say, well, let's have a look at this and see what we're going to do. And Parliament will want to look at it. Because, you know, remember, the one thing, again, what was strange and really unsatisfactory, I think, about the referendum campaign is the devil really is in the detail with this. You see, I was constantly trying to say to people, if you were deciding whether to join the European Union, that's one sort of debate. Okay, and that's the debate we had in the 70s. When you're deciding whether to leave after 4 decades of membership, when there's intricate trading and commercial relationships and political relationships that are growing up, we need to see that. We need to see, for example, who's going to win that battle in the French politics between those who say the border should go back with the EU to Dover now, or the border's going to stay in Calais. I mean, that's an important consideration. So all of these things, I think, allow us now to be, now we're going to see the new the new home. Now we're going to look at it, we're going to test it, we're going to be going around it, we're going to be seeing what it really means. And so, in a sense, what I'm saying is we have a divided country, but I think there is the possibility of bringing people back together if we're sensible about it and don't let our sort of dismay on either side of this argument get the better of our judgment.
Why did Remain, why did your side of the campaign lose?
I mean, I don't think that's very hard to work out. You could, by the way, have this type of referendum anywhere in Europe at the moment, and you would have the potential for the result to be the same. And one of the things that I think it's important for us as we go into this European negotiation is Europe itself can take one of two views. They can either say, OK, you guys have said you're going to leave, get out as fast as possible. Right, exactly. The other thing they could do, and maybe they should do when they reflect about it, again, if we approach this negotiation sensibly, is to think, yeah, OK, the British had their referendum, but actually we have the same strains of opinion, the same anxieties in our own countries. Let's think about how we deal with those. And let's not look upon the Brits, as it were, as outliers who are just, you know, where they were always difficult in Europe and now we got rid of the difficult people. No, every country's got its people who are anxious about issues like migration, who are anxious about the effect of globalization on jobs and so on. So I think, you know, it's not hard to see why Leave won. I mean, obviously, I think, you know, personally, I think it's a very serious mistake for us, but there it is. It's not hard to see how they win. But
but why did they win? You still haven't told me why they won.
Because I think when you take a dissatisfaction with the status quo politically and anxiety about flatlining incomes, worries about immigration particularly, and immigration, look, immigration has always been, let's be very clear, you can go back in, you and I remember going back 30, 40 years, immigration's always been an issue where if you mobilize opinion around it, particularly, frankly, if you've got a large clutch of newspapers and the British media are prepared to take your platform and really run with it, you know, you're always going to, a referendum in those circumstances is going to be a tough thing, and it would be a tough thing in any country.
But immigration has never been bigger, and a lot of the British people felt not so much about the numbers coming in, as it's very well for these politicians to let the people in, but they're not building the schools, they're not building the hospitals, they're not building the public services that we need if these numbers are to go. And they felt the British political elite on the left and right were not listening to them. And they may have been right.
Well, I think you do have to listen to people on immigration. I mean, I fought my last election campaign on immigration, and I know very well what a strong issue it is. But the answer to the problems and the pressures from Eastern Europe particularly, because remember, these people, look, I think the Eastern Europeans make actually a pretty good contribution to this country.
But you didn't build the houses for them coming in. Neither the last Labour government nor this government has built enough. And that was the kind of reaction. And I would suggest, Mr. Blair, it's also why the Labour Party couldn't mobilise its vote for a massive turnout for Remain. I mean, you're the man that made Labour love the EU. When you became an MP, the Labour Party was pretty hostile to the EU. You made it love it, but it did not love it on Thursday.
No, that's true. But on the other hand, the answer to these problems is to deal with the issues of housing and the health service and education. Well, hang on. First of all, by the way, we invested massively in these communities, in education and healthcare particularly.
But not in housing.
Housing, I think, is a real issue, and I think it's one that we have to take very, very seriously. But the right way to deal with it is to have a housing policy for the population as a whole. You know, in the end, we've got to decide whether... Because, of course, the other thing about immigration is that it all gets lumped together. I think a lot of people's anxieties about immigration were not particularly centred around those from Europe, but those from outside Europe. However, I do accept there were communities, and when people see their communities changing around them as a result of an influx of people, you've got to deal with that. So, yes, I agree. Unfortunately, the answer to it is not to get out of Europe.
Would your side might not have won if Labour hadn't fought such a half-hearted campaign?
Well, I've made my comments on the campaign, and I think, you know, what is really important for us is to be able to make sure that our own people understand why we were so passionate about staying in Europe, because none of the problems that our voters face, problems of pressures on housing and jobs and healthcare and education, they're not going to be resolved by leaving Europe. And one of the things I think will also happen over the months to come is that as this reality that I keep saying, you know, now you can test this by reality, as that sinks in, then I think there will be a lot of Labour voters that will be realising this is not a smart move that the country's made.
This morning, after the sacking of Hilary Benn, a prominent supporter of Remain in the shadow cabinet, fired by Jeremy Corbyn, there seems to be a mounting coup inside the Labour Party, inside the parliamentary party against Mr Corbyn. Should there be a coup?
You know, I was coming on this programme to talk about Europe, and you know, I know this is what
hard not to ask you about what's going on in the Labour Party this morning.
I totally understand why you have to ask me. I really don't want to get... I mean, I know nothing more than what I've read in the newspapers and heard on the news, and I think this is for the parliamentary party, and it's not... I don't think it's actually right for me, or and certainly not helpful for me to intervene on it. So I'm not going to.
The former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, speaking to me earlier this morning, but not about Labour's mounting troubles today. They've just got a little bit more serious. Another Labour MP, Ivan Lewis, he's running for mayor